From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports podcast.
The fastest growing entertainment phenomenon of this generation.
I, Prophet of Esports, joined today by my friend and co-host William Collis.
Yeah, we got the book of esports out. It's a big deal.
So everyone knows me as the Prophet and William as the Professor.
The Business of Esports podcast is sponsored by Esports Entertainment Group, a leading esports and online gambling company. For more information, go check them out at esportsentertainmentgroup.com. From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports podcast. I am Paul Doalibi. I'm joined today by my friend and co-host, William Collis. For those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome to the official podcast of esports. What we do here is we cover the most pressing gaming and esports topics and news of the week, but we look at all of it through a business and C-suite lens. We dissect, we analyze the business implications of everything happening in this industry. For our regular listeners, thank you guys for tuning in every week. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being so committed to the podcast. Thank you for leaving those 5-star ratings and reviews, telling your friends. If you haven't already, go do that. Leave a great review on the podcast, or even better, go leave a great review for William's book, The Book of Esports. If you haven't bought it yet, or if you have bought it, go buy it, leave a review on Amazon, tell them how much you love it. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing read. Highly recommend it, guys.
10 of 10.
I mean, you're a little biased, William, but I'm not.
I mean, I think I'm slight biased to favor stuff I write. So yeah.
if I push the socks, then I'm biased, right?
Yes, yes. I'll push the socks for you. The socks are epic.
The socks are epic. Business of Esports socks.
If you haven't gotten the Business of Esports socks, they're great.
There are socks.
Wow. That's our guest who's we got to intro him saying we have a fantastic guest today.
William, how's it going?
Well, it's going well, Paul. You know, we had the E3 stuff. We got an Elden Ring trailer. Can we talk about that? We got an Elden Ring trailer. Yep.
Yeah. Were you wowed?
You know,
were you gripped like by the E3 coverage and all the content? And
let me tell you this. I was excited to see the Elden Ring trailer, but you know, it's one of those things where it's just another Dark Souls game. Like, unless I miss something amazing, like, and I'm not disappointed. Like, that's what I wanted. Like, I love that genre. But I was watching, I was like, oh, this could be Dark Souls 4, and like, I wouldn't miss a beat. You know what I mean? Like, so.
Yeah, I mean, but did you enjoy? Do you think E3 needed to happen? Like, did you enjoy the content?
You know, I don't think these things really need to happen anymore. I do think there need to be unveil events and everything, but I think it's better done as publisher specific today, right? Like, I think there probably does need to be a clearinghouse event for the smaller publishers that can't command their own, you know, audience enough to make it happen, to make it like, you know, to drive, you know, significant viewership. But I don't think that event should occupy the same space it does historically as like an E3 unveiling has done. You know, I think the era of that being like the conference that you must watch to know the future of gaming is gone now. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I now put E3 in the same group as like the awards shows. It's like completely useless. Like, it's so cringy. The whole show just was a mess for me. Like, I don't know. It's
There's
just
an Elden Ring trailer. I mean, how do you get
that everyone can go watch on YouTube, right? Or the reality is, and I had this discussion with someone on LinkedIn because I posted my feelings on E3 and how much I genuinely hated this show, and I thought it was an embarrassment. And it's an embarrassment. I mean, this is the beautiful dichotomy of gaming from an investor standpoint, right? Gaming is going to continue to explode, yet there's no interesting games coming out, right? Like, there's literally not one game that like wowed me. There was a bunch of mobile garbage. There was a bunch of like rehashed side scrollers or RPGs, like no new ideas. Where's the innovation, William?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, but again, it sort of goes back to what I think, which is if you have, and we should introduce our guest in a second because this is a
Yes.
bigger topic.
Yes.
Maybe we should get our guest in to comment on this. But like, if you truly have the most break frame, amazing game launch, right? Why would you put it out at E3 when there's all this other clutter, right?
But it's not even clutter. It's like there are so many better channels. Like go pay Shroud to play your FPS game, right? That's a way better. To me, this is the modern way of game marketing. You don't need E3 anymore. This is a dinosaur. The same way the award shows are dinosaurs. It's just so all the game developers and industry people can all pat each other on the back is what it is.
Yeah, I don't know, bro. I mean, like, like I think there is a place for these clearinghouse.
This is why I get nominated for so many awards. When
Yeah,
I say
this
that
is
the
why
award
Paul-
shows are all like hot
Paul's announcing
garbage.
his own games trailer conference calls like, no, but like, there is a place for these things. But the thing is, I think the big publishers have figured out that they command enough of an audience, they can just drive it themselves, right? Like Blizzard was like, oh, we have such a big audience, we can just do BlizzCon, right?
Yeah.
And then we control.
If only
the whole
they had a game
narrative.
to announce.
It's all us end to end. We can do all our big stuff there. And I think the publishers have by and large realized this, that you don't want to be competing with all the other announcements and titles. So what this event becomes a little bit is I don't want to say filler, because there is significant stuff that comes out. But, to your point, it's not like it used to be you would go to E3 and like the landscape of the next year would be laid before you. You would know like, okay, these are the major tent poles. These are what the publishers are doing. And it really mattered from a business perspective because you basically got your next year of gaming in front of you. That's not the case. Like every major title that is coming in the next 1 to 2 years was not announced and shown at E3 today. You know what I mean? Like that's just not how it's done anymore. And as a result, like, yeah, you see some interesting stuff. And as you said, Paul, you can watch the trailers on YouTube and it's exciting. And again, there is a place, I think, particularly the smaller publishers, and you don't have to be that small, just small enough that you don't command an audience in and of yourself. I think it benefits from an aggregator, from a press and an awareness standpoint. So there are people, but the moment of this being like, this is the amuse-bouche for the next year of gaming is gone. You know what I mean? Yeah. Also, I used amuse-bouche, so like.
On that note, William, call this the amuse-bouche for really what is the main course of this podcast, and It's none other than an amazing guest this week. Absolutely amazing guest. We have Adam Gertz, who is Senior Counsel and Head of Esports at Morrison Rothman. For those of you who don't know Morrison Rothman, digital entertainment, gaming, law firm. They rep more esports teams, content creators, you name it, than anyone else around. Very excited to have you on the show, Adam. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely, guys. It's great to be here.
So before I put you on the spot on E3, would love for our listeners to have a bit of your story, your background, how you got into the legal side of gaming specifically, but also just your general thoughts around, excitement around gaming.
Yes, so I guess I'll start with my background. So I kind of came into esports, from a very untraditional way. I went to college in DC because, I thought I wanted to be a diplomat or a CIA agent or something like that. And I worked in international economic policy for 2 years after college and was just like, this is not for me at all. So I decided, loved games, loved the idea of the business of games. This was still, esports was still like, a hobby at that point. But I just realized this is where I want to be. So how do I get into this industry? I don't have a background in programming. I don't have a background in graphic design, creative, business, anything like that. Okay, I'll go to law school. So I went to law school in LA, focused on entertainment and gaming law. And right out of law school, I ended up working for Mayor Garcetti, which is the logical step, I think, when you're trying to break into the video game industry. So I ended up doing that for a few years, after which time I moved to a business litigation firm where I was able to do a little bit more with IP, with privacy, trademark, a little bit in gaming, etc. And then I made the move laterally to Morrison Rothman. I had but I met Ryan Morrison on a couple occasions, had joined the Esports Bar Association, which started in 2018. So met him through that and was sort of able to parlay that into pretty much my dream job. So that's sort of how I got here. As far as what do I do on a day-to-day basis, right? Because I get that question a lot, most notably from my parents. What is esports? Like, what do you do as an esports attorney? So, bit of background: Morrison Rothman represents primarily players and what we are in the industry is referred to as content creators. So, those are professional gamers who don't necessarily play it competitively. I think you mentioned Shroud, XQC, Nick Merckx, Tim the Tap Man are some of the bigger ones who come to mind. And they're on Twitch, they're on YouTube, etc. And we represent them from the legal side. So a lot of what I do on a day-to-day basis as an esports attorney is just looking at those player agreements, whether it's with teams and orgs or whether it's with brands for sponsorship deals, and just basically advocating for their rights, advocating for player rights, and making sure that the industry is more equitable. I think Ryan kind of pioneered the idea of, these players should be treated, a little bit better from a legal standpoint, and we're just trying to advance that along. And the other side of what I do is, as esports grows and as these players get bigger and bigger, they start other ventures. So pretty much like any other law firm, we work with them from a small business perspective to help set those up, whether it's a apparel label or whether it's a company that they're working with, investing or something like that. So that's a bit of the day to day. And so I really love working in esports because it's such a young industry, and particularly from a legal perspective, I like to, and I don't want to sound too arrogant when I say this, I know it might come across as that, but I like to think we're kind of, establishing not necessarily the law, right? There's no esports law, there's no esports statutes, but, our firm and a few other firms in the space and a few other attorneys in the space are kind of establishing the legal norms as we go. So that's, I think, really exciting. And then I really like how esports and content creation, even more so than esports, is becoming kind of this next generation of entertainment. I think I made the comment on Twitter the other day, like whenever I am going over one of these org agreements, I feel like I am, in some sort of young adult, dystopia or Harry Potter. Like each, major content creator is picking from the sorting hat. Okay, am I FaZe? Am I 100 Thieves? Am I Envy? Am I Cloud? Where do I belong? And it's each organization has kind of established their own unique culture and their own unique impression on the gaming and content creation industry. And just being able to watch that and being able to watch this new generation of entertainment kind of take over, I think, is really exciting.
It's such an awesome story, Adam. And now that I've heard it here, I will say I'm going to take all the credit for your entire career now, because once upon a time, total side note, I was at a very, very high profile fundraiser for Mr. Garcetti, thrown by none other than the Winklevoss twins, believe it or not.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing.
At their home in LA. It was a bit surreal because of the people who were in that room, but I'm sure that one fundraiser was why he won and therefore why he hired you. It makes perfect sense to me.
I see nothing wrong with that logic at all. Yeah, I think so. Thank you, sir, for making me what I am today.
Paul's a big believer in the butterfly effect. Like,
but no, Adam, seriously, one of the things I'm curious about, we'll get to E3 at the end, but I have some questions first. One of the things I'm most curious about is, we've had talent agents on this podcast, right? Like the WMEs of the world, the CAAs of the world, who are all getting into gaming in a big way. And where do you see yourselves? Because in some ways, I feel like there's overlap there in terms of what they say they do and what you guys say you do. Do you feel like there's overlap between these businesses? Do you see the agencies as direct competitors? Do you see it as collaborators? Like how do you look at that piece of the ecosystem from a macro standpoint?
Sure. So to answer your question, certainly see the agencies as collaborators, whether that's Evolved, which is Ryan's agency, who our firm does a ton of work for, or whether that's a CAA, a WME, a UTA, Loaded, any one of those, I think, because at the end of the day, at least as far as our firm is concerned, everybody there is representing, the rights of the talent. Now, where there can be some overlap is, I mentioned we're negotiating contracts. Well, so are the agents. And where we try to separate the two is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, the concept of if you're at a studio and you're an attorney, like when I say studio, I mean Warner Brothers, Universal, something like that. You're generally, if you're on the sort of production side, or the talent side, I should say, you're either in sort of the business affairs side or you're on the legal affairs side. And I like business affairs primarily handles the numbers, the substance, what is going on, how much are they getting paid, what are the perks, do they have a gym, like a Peloton in their trailer, that sort of thing. And then the legal affairs side is all that. You get a 25-page contract. The legal affairs is the last 20 pages of that contract. And so I kind of liken what we do at the firm to sort of the legal affairs side. It's going through all of the stuff that nobody wants to read, but at the end of the day really, really matters in the still hopefully extraordinarily unlikely event that there is some sort of conflict. And at the outset of esports and at the outset of content creation, you obviously found that the language in those sections were heavily weighted towards the teams or heavily weighted towards the brands as far as risk allocation. And I absolutely understand that. But, as a player's attorney, I try to somewhat level that playing field and work with the agents to make sure that, okay, you guys are making sure they're getting the compensation that they deserve, and you're making sure that they're not working too many hours or having to do too many streams. I'm going to make sure that they're not on the hook, legally speaking, if the entire industry changes its perspective, or I want to make sure the brand is protecting them in the event this trademark that they're out here pitching is infringing or something like that.
Where do you see that balance of power today, Adam, versus like 5 years ago between talent / content creator / esports competitor versus a game publisher or a brand or whoever might be on the other side of these deals? Like, do you find the balance of power has changed at all? Has it transformed in some way? Like, I'm curious if you have insight over the last few years, how this dynamic has changed or maybe not changed.
Sure. Even in the past 2 years, I've definitely seen a shift. Not a tremendous shift, but definitely a shift towards more equitable balance of power between the creators and the players, and between the teams, orgs, and brands. Now, like everything, like any good lawyer, I'm going to say with any answer, it depends. And what does that depend on? Well, it depends primarily on who the player is, who the creator is, and who the team is, and who the brand is. Now, I don't want to get into any specific teams, but there are certain orgs, for example, that will want to work with the talent and will, be very receptive to changes. Not necessarily, crazy changes, and that's not what I go in and try to make. I don't ever want to come in too hot as an attorney because I don't want to kill the deal. I just make changes that I think don't necessarily change the substance, don't necessarily make it any more risky for the brand, but just try to make things more equitable. And so there are teams that are, at the end of the day, more receptive to that, more willing to negotiate. And then there are orgs that are not so much and are just like, this is kind of a take it or leave it type situation. Now, I will say that the overwhelming majority of the tier 1 orgs that I work with are in the former camp. So they have great representation who understand that at the end of the day, we're all here to get a deal done. We're all here to advance this industry. Let's figure out how we can make it work. It's, I think, where I still see that sort of, no, you know what, we don't care. We're not going to change much, is some of these newer orgs, or particularly overseas, some of the European teams and orgs still remain a little bit entrenched when it comes to their contractual language. But like I said, 5-6 years ago, esports was in a situation legally where you would want to join a team as like a 19-year-old, and they would say, great, we're going to pay you a couple grand a month, but we pretty much own everything you do. Everything's going to be exclusive to us. And, we might give you a t-shirt and a medal or something if you win. And, if you get an attorney to read this agreement, the deal's off. Like, here's the agreement. It's whatever it was, 10, 15, 20 pages. You can't get an attorney. You can't get an agent to negotiate this for you. You got to sign this within, 6 hours or the deal's off. And most kids did, because you can understand, right? You're this 19-year-old, or I don't mean to pick on 19-year-olds. You're a young kid, and you have the opportunity to play video games professionally, and you get a jersey, and you don't care about any of this. But as the industry matures, more and more players are starting to acknowledge their agency. They're starting to acknowledge that they have power in these negotiations, and they're starting to realize how some of the language, even that super nitty-gritty in the weeds language, can, at the end of the day, affect them if things go bad. And they're starting to take more of a leadership role in those negotiations. And that's really what it's going to take at the end of the day to ultimately balance the scales, is the agents and the lawyers. We can only do so much. We can advise, we can advocate, but the decision as to whether someone says yes or no, that's always going to be on the player. So the more and more the players and the creators, start to, take this, not, I don't want to say they don't take it seriously, but the more they start to focus on, hey, I can negotiate here, and hey, I should have these rights because this org isn't making my brands. I made my brands, and I should, stick up for myself. That's really what it's, I think, going to take.
Adam, I'm curious, is there a point where, though, that goes too far, like where you guys do too good of a job, and you end up with a lot of esports teams that are already struggling to monetize, and now they're paying players, tens of millions of dollars because Adam's really good at his job, right? And and then you end up with an industry that maybe has a reverse problem. Like, is there a point where you think there is a natural balance, or because of pros like you that are really good at doing this, that maybe the players in the long run have a bit of an advantage here?
Well, first of all, disclaimer, as an attorney, I am obligated to say that I only enter these negotiations with the best interests of my client in mind. But, that aside, I agree. There is a balance that needs to be had, because right now the economics of the esports industry are such that in order to pay the players the salaries that the agents negotiate for them, that money has to come from somewhere, right? Now, a lot of esports orgs are owned by high net worth individuals, or they're backed with, a lot of financing. But eventually, at some point, that's going to run out, right? And until you get the lucrative sort of TV deals, if that ever comes, which is where most of the money, or ticket sales, which is where most of the money comes in from traditional sports, how do you monetize? And you monetize, one of the, and I'm not by any means no expert on, the numbers here, but one of the primary means that teams are able to generate revenue is through sponsorship. And so, to speak to your point with balance, one of the conversations we have to have with players is like, look, by signing onto this agreement, the team is going to want you to perform services on behalf of their team sponsors, which in all likelihood is going to be to the exclusion of services you can perform as an individual for certain sponsors down the road. Now, depending, again, it depends. Depending on the talent, they're going to look at that and say, that's fine, I don't really care. Independent sponsorships are not something that I typically, generate a ton of revenue from or even so much care about. The flip side of that is some of them will say, well, okay, can we get some categories there carved out so I can at least keep my deal for this computer or this keyboard or this drink or whatever? And that's, where it becomes a negotiation. Now, again, I have to go in and explain that to the client, but at the end of the day, I have to advocate and represent what they want. But one of the things we try to do in that sense is say, look, to keep this alive, to keep this going, we have to, again, going back to establishing, these norms is like, all right, this is how the economics depend on it. And this is something that, if it's not too much trouble, you probably will want to take a look at. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the players, at least from our perspective, do have some autonomy there, and they're not completely cut off from doing any independent sponsorship if they want. And that's sort of one of the major negotiating points in these deals.
William, I'm sorry, I'm hogging here. I don't know if you had specific questions. I have a couple more, but go ahead. You're muted.
Oops, sorry guys. No, my question, Adam, actually goes back to kind of something early you said here, which is you get to set the norms for esports law, right? And my question I was going to ask you was, if there's one norm you could set for the industry right now, like you could help to contribute to bring into being, like what would it be and why would you want it normed that way? I'm trying to give people insight into if you're shaping some of the legal standards here, like what standards you think is most important to shape, basically.
I think going back to, I think the conversation we were just having, what I would love, and this is kind of a combo legal and business affairs and agency thing, but it's sort of being able to assign a value or otherwise monetize social media, Twitch, et cetera, activations in the context of independent sponsorship work. So, right now, a lot of what you see is, okay, if we give you, promotional obligations, you guys have to perform those. There's really no set amount there. Or on the flip side, we have approval over any independent sponsor that you want to do, whether that approval can be, super discretionary or sort of more of a rubber stamp. That remains to be seen. But we also want to lock up all of these categories, and then you see a list of like any category of goods and services that comes to mind, and it's like, oh, cool. So if my player wants to go out and shill for pacemakers, he can go do that, I suppose. But everything else is kind of off the table. So what I would love to see the norm is, paying to have those categories locked up. And it's like, okay, I agree to the exclusivity there, but since you're causing me to forego some of these opportunities, I would like to be duly compensated for that give, so to speak. And yeah, I think that would be one of the areas. And this is going to be a controversial take, I think, if we're going to talk about more legal areas that I want to see changed. And personally, I don't necessarily know what the right solution is here. But as it stands right now, like a lot of what these content creators are doing, we have in real life IRL streamers, just chatting streamers who are very popular, but the vast majority of them are still playing games online. They're playing games on Twitch. And however you slice that, if you take a look at it from a purely copyright legal perspective, that's an unauthorized public performance, reproduction, what have you, of a copyrighted work, the copyrighted work being the video game. And so and it's tolerated, right, by the gaming companies themselves, I think for obvious reasons. But, at the end of the day, that again, planning for that super unlikely outcome. That's sort of my job. It's like, all right, I don't necessarily want the players to be the ones holding the bag, so to speak, if and when a gaming company one day decides, you know what, like more people are watching, Nick Merckx play our games than actually playing them. And so, okay, we want to start charging licensing fees now. Will that ever happen? Highly doubt it. But if you read these agreements, the players have to basically be legally responsible in the event that something like that does happen. And I don't necessarily know what the right solution for that is. Obviously, copyright laws exist for a reason, and publishers, absolutely should have the right to enforce those. But I think there needs to be some sort of legal catalyst to kind of, okay, is this fair use, so to speak? Is that the solution? Or can streamers themselves, sort of have a safe harbor similar to what exists for Twitch or YouTube under the DMCA or something like that? So yeah, that is a long-winded way to answer your question in two parts, I suppose.
No, it's really interesting to hear, and it's interesting to hear, like so much about the player advocacy perspective and player control in the space. And I definitely understand your point that from a legal perspective, maybe that's something that's been lacking and that needs to come in more aggressively. And certainly, some of the big, contests we've seen have been players challenging their orgs specifically about this. So it's helpful context. I don't know, Paul, anything else you'd want to add? Or
Yeah, I was fascinated by the second piece of that, right? Like fast forward 10 years and is everyone going to be Nintendo? And like, that doesn't want anyone,
Yeah, Adam, do you see that happening? Like quite seriously, like in the world that because you're talking about preventing it. I mean, I get that you have to close off, unlikely avenues, but do you see, like from your vantage point, do you see a world where, EA is suddenly like, hey guys, not happening ever, the media side of this is so valuable, we're no longer going to let this be the leaky sieve in the business model?
Yeah, at this point, I don't, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I know some publishers tried and very publicly failed to get their stuff taken down from Twitch some years ago. But again, it just, from my perspective, it's just the legal risk thing, and the talent who's benefiting the org, who's benefiting the brand, who's benefiting Twitch, who's benefiting the publisher. From there's so many people that the streamer is sitting there, and obviously they're getting paid and they're getting famous from it, but so are all these other ancillary parties. It just, to me, doesn't seem equitable for them to be the ones to kind of shoulder all of that risk, at least from a contractual standpoint. And it also creates loopholes in some of these agreements that I, as an attorney, I just don't care for. So, but to answer your question, William, I don't really see it happening. But as you said, who knows what can happen in 10 years? The entire landscape might change. With the younger generation, like watching Twitch not only as a way to watch their favorite streamers, but as what you do on like a Saturday night, right? Or what you do on a weeknight, instead of watching instead of binging the latest Netflix show, you and your partner are sitting there, watching your favorite streamer play the next coolest game. And if that really becomes the baseline entertainment for the biggest demo in the country, history tells us that there's going to be some sort of reckoning as far as the economic benefit that the publishers expect to attain from that. So I don't see it happening anytime soon, but there's no telling 5-10 years from now if that will still be the case.
I don't see it happening either, guys. Just because I feel like all the developers would have to agree, right? All the publishers would have to agree to go this route, because it's too easy to just, for Nick Merckx to say, okay, fine, EA wants to be, tough about it, I'll go play,
Actually,
Blizzard's game or,
that's a-
Activision's game, or like,
Mhm.
it's just
That's
too
a-
easy to switch.
That's a great point, Paul, that if it's not coordinated, the incentive, because like what, Nick Merckx is going to be like, oh, I can't play, my favorite game anymore. I'm done. No, the guy's going to switch games. He's going to go to a
Yeah,
game
I
with
can't
him.
play Call of Duty. I'll go
And-
play Apex or
And the
Battlefield or
market
like
for
I don't know.
viewing won't go away. Like if suddenly you could no longer watch Apex, I think people wouldn't be like, oh, I'm not watching any more people play games ever again. They just find a different game they could watch that was like Apex. So you're right. The coordination problem is a really severe problem here. And you're right. That alone probably makes this world an unlikely world to live in.
It would also make them all kind of hypocrites in the sense that they're all benefiting from this
Exactly.
right now. Right? Like,
Oh,
yes, I called every game publisher a hypocrite. I don't know what to tell you.
Well, speaking of game publishers, should we do some news now? Should we?
Well,
roll
no,
in?
hold on. This to me is
Okay,
the
go.
perfect segue for E3 because I want to get Adam's view on this, right?
Oh,
Which is
snap.
like, you have all these publishers benefiting from people watching others play their game. This is like, to me, the number one marketing channel for new games. If Nick Merckx plays it, chances are everyone watching him will at least go check it out, look at it on Steam, maybe not buy it, but it drives a lot of eyeballs to your game. In that world, Adam, do you think E3 is still relevant? Did you enjoy the content? I'm curious your thoughts in general.
Do I think E3 is still relevant? I think it, if it doesn't necessarily hold the same utility as it once did, as far as what you guys were saying earlier, in that E3 back in the day used to be this sort of jump off point for the next year as far as gaming, and obviously everything, I think for the most part, that was released at E3 this year already had trailers or gameplay footage up, or everybody knew was coming, so it wasn't that much of a surprise. But I do think there's something to be said for the idea of seeing the industry coming together and celebrating itself, and sort of celebrating what folks have worked for, if not so much from a fan knowledge perspective, but as in a way to sort of maintain the pulse of the industry. And I'm looking at this bit of colored glasses, because when I first moved to LA, I lived downtown for the first 5 years I was out here, and so each summer I saw all the E3 folks come to town, and this was either right before they started letting fans in, or right when they started letting fans in. But I was
5 years ago, I think, was the first totally open to the public.
Yeah, exactly. And so when they did open it to the public, I was either a good little law student or a good little worker bee, and didn't take time off during the day. But up until I first started at Morrison Rothman and was in the industry, I was always kind of on the outside looking in. And so my first E3 was 2019, which was also the last in-person E3 for obvious reasons. So I went there, and I was like geeking out on the floor and had the time of my life, and it was just so cool to be a part of the industry. So I think from the sort of fanboy perspective that I'm sort of giving you guys here, I like it that way. But as far as whether it's necessary for the industry, no. I mean, I think everything's virtual now. Like, you would go to E3 and you would have meetings on meetings. And I think if you're a major publisher, probably not necessary for you, right? But if you're one of those indie publishers, or you're a small agency or a small firm, whether law firm, marketing firm, or whatever, and you just want to be a part of the industry, I think it's events like E3 and GDC and PAX and the others are really great to network. And I think from that perspective, it's very valuable. But as far as just being an aggregate of the news of the industry, I think you have the internet for that now. So
I love the take. Far more diplomatic than mine. All right, guys, let's look at some news here. Some things that were in the news this week. Interesting stories from the gaming and esports industry. And I'll bring the first one up here. This one, It was an eye-catching headline. I haven't seen these sort of topics together in one sentence, at least not recently. And that is, this is from esportstalk.com. FBI forms unit to combat esports corruption and more. The article goes on to talk about how the FBI has this new, what they call sports and esports unit, being headed up by Joseph Gillespie. It's part of what they call their new sport and gaming initiative. They're going to be focused on these transnational sports competitions, dealing with corruption, dealing with match fixing, dealing with gambling related crimes primarily. Adam, my question for you, obviously as a lawyer, just the broader question here of how much regulation do you think esports as an industry still needs? Is it too soon for the FBI to be looking at this? And I'm just curious, the broader, like, how much regulation do you think we still need as an industry for things to operate efficiently and transparently?
I think it's, as an industry, I don't necessarily think we're at a point, at least in the U.S., where the FBI needs to get involved with this whole task force dedicated to, anti-corruption within esports. Like, it's, obviously, match fixing has historically been not an insignificant problem in overseas, particularly if you look at titles like StarCraft or something like that. But as far as in the U.S., I think while there may be a little bit in some of the lesser known competitions, I think the industry itself does a really good job of kind of self-policing and self-regulating and ensuring that the matches are fair and not corrupt and all that. You look at, LCS, the Overwatch League, the Call of Duty League, these are doing, I think, at least not that I've seen, have too many issues with match fixing. And I think, if you look at the core of match fixing and why that happens is, typically the players aren't paid very much, but they are working, however many hours a day. They're sitting there gaming 18 hours a day. They don't really have time to go out and make a decent salary, but they still have to be able to eat. So I think the temptation for match fixing in competitions that aren't as regulated as the tier one competitions here in the US or particularly overseas is definitely there. I don't want to discount that. But I think one of the obvious ways to put a stop to that is, again, the player advocacy side, making sure everything's more equitable, making sure they're getting paid better so that they don't necessarily have to go down that path. And again, I think we're doing a good job here. When I hear FBI task force, I feel like, the esports is, I think of like, some 1940s, era gangster thing, running the numbers or fixing like boxing matches. Like, he's going to go down in the 5th round.
I know, right? Like, it's like Al Capone that pops up, right? Like, that's what you think of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're gonna get them, sweep the American Northwest,
and I'm not a criminal attorney, and I don't play one on TV, and nor do I know the ins and outs of what the FBI is dealing with. I'm sure they have reasons for wanting to do this, but I don't think if it's purely to go after some sort of criminal organization or some sort of criminal element that they think is hampering esports, I suppose that's fine. But as far as regulation, I don't really think more regulation is necessary at this point.
My question here is sort of just a bigger scope thing, which is like, this is not the first time we've seen government agencies considering action on esports, right? We had the EA loot boxes. Now we have this. Historically, there's been concerns about other types of consumer rights, like redemption or returns or things. Like my question here is like, at what point does all of this stuff get collected somehow? Because I think it's all kind of meaningfully interrelated to each other in this idea that like games have evolved to be a really significant industry, right? With all the ancillary baggage and all the plug-in industries that come with being a major media powerhouse, right? But it does sort of look a bit like whack-a-mole. Like we're going to get it here, we're going to get it here, we're going to get it here. Like from your vantage point, Adam, do you see something larger and more coherent coming, in terms of how gaming is going to be treated from a regulatory perspective? Or do you see this trend of sort of one-off solutions continuing?
That's an interesting question and a really good one. I think you mentioned the loot boxes and the redemptions, and sort of it comes down to won't somebody please think of the children? And I think that's sort of the primary driver, is that games. I don't think this is necessarily true anymore, but games are looked at by the policy rulemaking body as appealing primarily to young children who aren't necessarily sophisticated enough to understand these certain things like loot boxes and chance. And to that point, I sort of am on their side. Like, yes, there should be some regulation there, but as far as whether that comes piecemeal or whether that comes as some sort of overbroad legislation, I would think an overbroad legislation would be very difficult to pass, because when you're talking about regulating gaming as an industry, what you're sort of talking about doing is also regulating what companies, what owners can do with their IP and with their speech. Games are speech, games are copyrighted intellectual property. So that's, I think, where you sort of get into the weeds as far as what that means. Now, when you're talking about, elements within that, like you're talking about loot boxes, or you're talking about, some sort of competitive integrity, whether that's, some sort of anti-doping initiative or something like that, I think that's different. But as far as creating a massive, sort of panacea for just video game competition and distribution regulation, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be an easy path.
Is it even necessary, guys? Like I had this thought, William, as you were talking, which is, there's a legal and regulatory framework around sports, and there's legal and regulatory frameworks around entertainment. Like, between those two things, we sort of have enough coverage, right? Like, does gaming and esports sort of need its own thing? Or does that sort of cover it? Like, in some ways, Adam, I feel like a lot of the entertainment law applies to, what you do probably on a day-to-day basis in the gaming and esports world. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no esports law, just like there's no video game law, there's no entertainment law. It's an amalgamation of multiple kinds of laws: copyright, trademark, corporate, contract law, labor and employment law. That's sort of everything that falls under esports. They're not, other than the actual product at the end of the day. Esports isn't doing anything differently than any other industry, so to speak. So I think it's, I know we talked about earlier sort of this need for some sort of potential decision as far as, okay, what constitutes fair use when you're talking about live streaming. So in that sense, there could be a carve out from copyright law, or whether that's done, via an appellate decision on fair use or something like that. But as far as whether esports itself needs to be more regulated than these other industries, which I think at this point would mean that it's more heavily regulated than these other industries. Like I said, in certain areas that can, touch on children, like loot boxes, sure, that's a legitimate conversation. But as a whole, no, I don't think so.
Can I just touch on one last thing on this, guys, before, which was, it was mentioned sort of in the article. It was alluded to in the article, but Adam, you mentioned it directly, which is anti-doping, right? And there's a story which I don't have up here, but I don't know if you guys saw, but I think it was 3 or 4 Call of Duty League players that came out basically admitting to having taken Adderall. At what point I don't remember exactly, but they took Adderall, and people believe this, increases your performance. As someone who represents talent, Adam, is there a future where you think you're going to have these conversations with clients that are like, hey, you need to do 2 drug tests a year, and this is good for the business of esports also, to try and keep a totally level competitive playing field? Or do you think that this is all just going to blow over, and no one's going to care if people are taking Adderall, and because this is not, no one's running faster than the other guy because of it.
Right. I think, it's a conversation we've already had, right? And I don't begrudge the leagues the opportunity to say, hey, if you're going to, compete for us, we want to make sure that you're not, taking Adderall because we believe, baseless or maybe backed by science or otherwise, that it makes you more aware, that it gives you a competitive advantage, and it's an artificial competitive advantage over folks that aren't taking Adderall. If that's what they want to do, I don't necessarily hold them at fault for that. The same way the NFL wants to make sure guys aren't using deer antler spray or something like that to give themselves a competitive advantage. As far as the public's appetite for it, I think you're always going to have 2 schools of thought there. I think you're going to have the sort of the purists who want to keep everything fair, and who want to make sure that it's entirely skill based. There's no artificial boosting or anything like that. And then you're going to have the other side, more laissez-faire, who is just like, what? Why does this really matter? It's not making them click any faster. It's not making them, understand, it's not making their situational awareness any better. It's not making them understand the maps or the character abilities any better. So, is there any reason for this? I don't see it necessarily as being as big of an issue as it was in baseball. But I think for the most part, you're always going to have those 2 schools of thought.
Interesting. I always feel like the baseball analogy is a good one, in the sense that it became an issue when the dollars started, like when the dollars are at stake, right? Like if you get a guy breaking home run records year after year because he's doping, this is bad for business for the other teams who maybe want to keep those records, or right? Like
exactly.
Usually when there's an economic sort of impact, that's when people start to care. And as a business podcast, I think that's an interesting sort of thought. Guys, we have that is all the time we have for this episode. William, I know you're shocked. I don't know if you wanted to get anything in before I wrapped here.
I guess that's all the time we have. No, I'm surprised. I wanted
like
to
50 minutes flew by here.
Yeah. Live stream, guys. All I'm going to say is live stream. There's tons of great topics we didn't get to, including one I was excited to talk about, so all I'm going to say is this is a shameless plug. Every Wednesday we do our live stream starting at 8:30. You get a bunch of news that wasn't on the podcast. You also often get the guests will join sometimes. Unfortunately, I don't think we can say that tonight for Adam, although it's retroactive. But it's a great opportunity to get more of us. And there'll certainly be, if you enjoyed the E3 talk on this podcast, I guarantee you we'll rehash E3 some more, at least on the live stream. So you should, if you want our perspective in more granular detail, you can check that out as well.
Yeah, I think I have to do dad duty tonight, unfortunately, but I would love to come back. This was really a lot of fun. So whether that's in this format or on the live stream, we'd be happy to do that.
Adam, we loved having you. Again, it's the best guests that we never get to actual news because there's just so much to dig into. If people want to, I don't know if you want to be reached, or if where can people find Morrison Rothman? Where can people find you or the firm?
So you can go to morrisonrothman.com, which is our firm website. I can be reached, Adam at morrisonrothman.com, or you're also free to tweet me at GERTZE821. And there you have it.
There you go. Follow Adam on Twitter and go check out Morrison Rothman, guys. And as always, like William mentioned, we do a live stream every Wednesday evening, 8:30
Amazing
Eastern
live stream.
time. Make sure you go leave a review on William's book, The Book of Esports. I know thousands of you have bought it. Tens of thousands of you have bought it. Go show him some love on Amazon and leave a review for the book. And go buy some Business of Esports socks, guys. They're a lot of fun. Show us some love. I promise you won't be disappointed. And as always, guys, we will see you next week.